The grand ballroom of the Nwosu mansion fell silent as an elderly maid let a silver tray crash onto the marble floor. Hundreds of wealthy guests gasped while security rushed toward her. Looking directly at the twin grooms, she spoke with a trembling but fearless voice. "If either of you marries these women today, your father's empire will be destroyed within a year." Laughter echoed through the hall as the brothers angrily ordered her thrown out. But before anyone could touch her, the old woman slowly removed her gray wig, and one terrified guest whispered, "That's Janet Nwosu." In a single heartbeat, smiles disappeared, secrets surfaced, and an unforgettable family reckoning began. Before we begin this emotional journey, tell us where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. We'd love to see how far this story travels across the world. If you enjoy powerful stories about love, justice, and hope, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next adventure. Janet Nwosu had spent more than 3 decades building one of Nigeria's most respected business empires. From a tiny textile warehouse on the outskirts of Lagos, she had transformed the Nwosu Group into a multinational corporation with investments in construction, agriculture, transportation, and renewable energy. Newspapers often described her as one of Africa's most influential businesswomen, but very few people understood the sacrifices hidden behind those headlines. She had buried her husband, Emeka Nwosu, nearly 15 years earlier after a sudden heart attack during an overseas business trip. Overnight, she became both a grieving widow and the sole guardian of 2 16-year-old boys who looked almost identical but possessed completely different personalities. The older twin by only 7 minutes, Chukwudi Nwosu, had inherited his father's calm nature. He rarely spoke before thinking and preferred spending time with employees rather than executives. Even after becoming executive director of the family's foundation, he still visited schools, hospitals, and villages without informing the media. His younger brother, Chinedu Nwosu, was equally intelligent but far more ambitious. He enjoyed business negotiations, expensive suits, luxury cars, and the attention that came with being the heir to an enormous fortune. Although he was not cruel, success had surrounded him for so long that he no longer noticed how differently ordinary people lived. Janet loved both sons equally. She also feared for them equally. Money could protect people from many dangers, but it often attracted the wrong hearts. As the twins approached their 33rd birthday, conversations about marriage became impossible to avoid. Business partners casually introduced their daughters during meetings. Politicians invited the brothers to private dinners. Charity galas somehow became opportunities for wealthy mothers to arrange accidental meetings. Within months, magazines were publishing lists of the women most likely to become the future daughters-in-law of the legendary Nwosu family. Janet quietly observed everything. One evening, while dining with her sons on the terrace overlooking Lagos, Chinedu smiled confidently. "I think it's finally time," he said. Janet looked at him. "Time for what?" "For marriage." Chukwudi chuckled. "You sound like you're announcing a company merger." Chinedu laughed. "Maybe marriage is the biggest merger of all." Janet smiled politely, though her heart felt strangely heavy. "So," she asked gently, "have either of you found someone you truly love?" The brothers exchanged uncertain glances. "There are several women we're getting to know," Chukwudi answered carefully. "They're all remarkable," Chinedu added. "Educated, successful, respected." Janet nodded. "And kind." Neither son answered immediately. The silence lasted only a few seconds. To Janet, it felt much longer. That night, she stood alone inside the enormous portrait gallery, where photographs of 4 generations of the Nwosu family lined the walls. She stopped before a portrait of her late husband. Emeka always believed one sentence: "Character is invisible until money appears." At the time, Janet had laughed. Years later, she understood exactly what he meant. The following week, she attended a charity fundraiser hosted by one of Lagos's wealthiest families. Dozens of elegantly dressed young women greeted her warmly. Every smile seemed perfect. Every compliment sounded rehearsed. One woman praised Janet's generosity while secretly rolling her eyes at a waitress who accidentally brushed against her handbag. Another spoke passionately about helping poor children before refusing to shake hands with the elderly cleaner wiping the entrance floor. Janet noticed every detail. Nobody else seemed to. When the event ended, she remained seated inside her car instead of returning home immediately. Her longtime driver, Musa, noticed she looked unusually quiet. "Madam," Janet looked out the window. "Do you know what frightens me most?" He waited respectfully. "I'm beginning to believe people treat me kindly because they recognize my face." Musa lowered his eyes. "I've wondered the same thing for many years." She turned toward him. "You have," he nodded. "When I drive one of the company vans, people shout at me. When I drive your Rolls-Royce, the same people call me Sir." Janet closed her eyes. His words confirmed everything she had feared. The following morning, she invited her oldest friend, retired Judge Ngozi Obi, to breakfast. Unlike most people in Janet's social circle, Ngozi had never been impressed by wealth. After listening quietly, the retired judge leaned back. "You already know the answer." Janet sighed. "I wish I didn't. You cannot choose wives for your sons." "I know. But you can discover who they really are." Janet frowned. "How?" Ngozi smiled mysteriously. "Disappear." Janet looked confused. "What do you mean? Become someone nobody respects?" The words lingered in the room. Several minutes passed before Janet spoke again. "You're suggesting I pretend to be poor?" "I'm suggesting you remove the only thing people see." That sentence changed everything. Over the next several days, Janet canceled public appearances, postponed interviews, and delegated company responsibilities to trusted executives. Officially, she was taking an extended wellness retreat outside the country. Only 4 people knew the truth: Ngozi, Musa, the family's personal physician, and Janet herself. An award-winning theatrical makeup artist was quietly invited to a private guest house owned by the family. For nearly 6 hours, he transformed Africa's most recognizable billionaire into someone nobody would notice. Soft wrinkles covered her face. Gray hair replaced her elegant hairstyle. Her expensive wardrobe disappeared beneath faded dresses and worn sandals. A slight bend in her back made her appear nearly 20 years older. When Janet finally stood before the mirror, even she struggled to recognize herself. She no longer looked like the powerful chairwoman of the Nwosu group. She looked like an elderly widow who had spent a lifetime working as a domestic servant. She whispered to her own reflection, "From today, Janet Nwosu disappears." Then she smiled sadly, "And Mama Ngozi begins." Somewhere else in Lagos, the 2 brothers continued meeting women who dreamed of becoming part of the Nwosu family, completely unaware that the greatest test of their lives had already begun. Their mother was no longer watching them from the head of the boardroom. She was about to watch them from the shadows. Mama Ngozi's first morning began before sunrise. The small rented apartment where Janet now lived was nothing like the luxurious mansion she had left behind. The walls were slightly cracked, the ceiling fan turned slowly with a faint squeak, and the narrow kitchen contained only a kettle, 2 cups, and a small gas stove. For the first time in decades, she prepared her own breakfast, without servants or assistants. She looked at her reflection in the tiny mirror hanging beside the front door. The wrinkles looked convincing. The gray wig fit perfectly. Even the slight tremble in her hands had become natural after several days of practice. She picked up an old canvas bag, locked the apartment, and stepped into the busy streets of Lagos. Nobody recognized her. People brushed past without making eye contact. Street vendors shouted to attract customers. Commercial buses filled the roads with noise. For the first time in many years, Janet experienced what it felt like to disappear into an ordinary crowd. Instead of feeling insulted, she felt strangely liberated. Her first destination was a luxury restaurant frequently visited by wealthy business families. Through one of the Nwosu group's trusted partners, arrangements had quietly been made for Mama Ngozi to work there temporarily as an elderly cleaner. The restaurant manager barely glanced at her application. "You've cleaned before?" "All my life," Janet answered softly. He nodded. "The pay isn't much. I'm grateful for any work. Start today." The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. No one asked about her education. No one asked about her experience managing billion-dollar companies. No one knew that the elderly woman standing quietly beside the mop bucket owned nearly half the buildings visible through the restaurant windows. She simply became another invisible worker. As lunchtime approached, expensive cars began arriving outside. Business executives, politicians, celebrities, socialites. Janet silently polished tables while observing every interaction. Many customers thanked waiters politely. Others ignored them completely. One young woman wearing an elegant white designer suit entered with several friends. Janet immediately recognized her from newspaper photographs. Adaobi Okafor, one of Lagos's most successful corporate attorneys. Several magazines had recently described her as a perfect match for Chinedu Nwosu. She carried herself with remarkable confidence. Her smile appeared warm. Her manners seemed flawless, at least while people were watching. As Janet wiped a nearby table, a young waiter accidentally bumped Adobe's chair while carrying drinks. Only a few drops spilled onto the floor. The waiter immediately apologized. "I'm so sorry, ma'am." Adobe's pleasant expression disappeared instantly. "Are you blind?" "No, ma'am." "Then why are you behaving like this?" "I'm truly sorry." She looked at the manager. People like him shouldn't be serving customers. The young man's face turned pale. Janet quietly continued cleaning while listening. The waiter couldn't have been older than 20. He apologized 3 more times. Adobe never accepted a single apology. When the manager promised complimentary desserts, her smile returned immediately. Minutes later, she laughed cheerfully with her friends, as though nothing had happened. Janet wrote one sentence inside a small notebook hidden in her apron pocket. Kindness disappears when status disappears. Later that afternoon, another customer arrived alone. She wore a simple blue dress without expensive jewelry. Her handbag looked several years old. The hostess greeted her politely. "Welcome," the young woman smiled. "Thank you." Janet noticed her immediately. Kelechi Eze, a primary school teacher. Unlike Adobe, Kelechi rarely appeared in newspapers. She had no influential family, no famous surname. She simply ordered a modest lunch before opening a stack of student exercise books to grade during her meal. Half an hour later, Janet deliberately allowed a spoon to slip from her hand. It clattered loudly beside Kelechi's table. Before any employee could react, Kelechi stood up. "Are you all right, Mama?" Janet smiled weakly. "My hands aren't as steady anymore." Kelechi bent down without hesitation. "It's all right." She picked up the spoon. Then she noticed Janet rubbing her lower back. "Have you been standing all day?" Janet nodded. "Please sit for a minute." "I can't. Why not?" "I still have work." Kelechi looked toward the manager. "I'll wait until she's feeling better before you clean my table." The manager frowned. "She'll be fine." "I don't mind waiting." There was no audience applauding her kindness, no cameras recording the moment. She simply acted naturally. Janet quietly thanked her. You remind me of my daughter. Kelechi smiled gently. I hope that's a good thing. The best. When Kelechi left the restaurant, she slipped a small packet of pain relief patches into Janet's hand. My grandmother uses these. You don't have to. I know. Then she walked away. Janet remained standing for several seconds. The patches probably cost very little, yet they carried more sincerity than many expensive gifts Janet had received over the years. That evening, she wrote another note. True kindness never checks who is watching. The following day brought another opportunity. A charity organization requested volunteers to distribute food in one of Lagos's poorer neighborhoods. Several wealthy young women attended because local television crews were covering the event. Among them was Adobe. She arrived wearing elegant casual clothes that looked carefully selected to appear humble. Photographers surrounded the volunteers. Adobe smiled warmly while handing food packages to elderly residents. Every camera captured her compassion. Then the television crew left for another location. Within minutes, everything changed. Adobe handed the remaining boxes to organizers. I've done enough. There are still many families waiting. I have another appointment. Without another glance, she entered her luxury vehicle and drove away. Janet watched silently. An hour later, Kelechi arrived after finishing classes at school. No reporters remained, no photographers, no publicity. She rolled up her sleeves immediately. Where do you still need help? One volunteer answered. There are families on the next street. I'll go. For nearly 4 hours, Kelechi carried heavy food parcels beneath the afternoon sun. She laughed with children. She comforted an elderly widow living alone. She helped a disabled man repair the broken wheel of his wheelchair. When one little girl offered her half a biscuit in gratitude, Kelechi accepted it with genuine appreciation. Janet felt her chest tighten. Nothing about the young teacher appeared rehearsed. Everything seemed effortless. As sunset approached, rain suddenly began falling. Volunteers rushed toward nearby shelters. Janet intentionally remained outside, pretending difficulty carrying one final box. Several expensive cars drove past without stopping. Moments later, someone opened an umbrella above her head. It was Kelechi. You'll catch a cold, Mama. I'll manage. No. She lifted the heavy box herself. We'll carry it together. They walked slowly through the rain. Neither woman spoke for several minutes. Finally, Janet asked quietly, Why are you helping an old stranger? Kelechi smiled. My mother used to say something. What did she say? The way you treat people who can never repay you reveals who you truly are. Janet looked at her with unexpected emotion. For years she had searched boardrooms for wisdom. Tonight she found it on a rain-soaked street beside a humble teacher carrying a cardboard box. Back in her apartment, Janet removed the gray wig and carefully opened her notebook once more. She stared at the growing list of observations. One name appeared beside words like arrogance, pride, and performance. Another appeared beside compassion, patience, and sincerity. The investigation had only just begun. Yet deep inside her heart, Janet feared the greatest challenge would not be discovering the truth. It would be convincing her sons to believe it. The following week, life inside the Nwosu family seemed perfectly ordinary. Neither Chukwudi nor Chinedu suspected that their mother was living under another name only a few kilometers away. According to the official story, Janet Nwosu was attending an extended wellness retreat in Europe after years of relentless work. She called her sons every few days, always keeping the conversations short and cheerful, so they would never question her absence. You two are taking good care of yourselves? She asked during one evening phone call. We're fine, Mother, Chukwudi replied. When are you coming home? Soon. We miss you. I miss you too. After hanging up, Janet smiled sadly. I hope you'll still say that when you learn the truth. The next morning, Mama Ngozi received another temporary cleaning assignment, this time at a prestigious business conference hosted in one of Lagos's finest hotels. Nearly every successful entrepreneur in the city would attend. So would dozens of ambitious young professionals hoping to expand their networks. Janet quietly pushed her cleaning cart through the elegant hallways while listening to countless conversations. Most discussions centered around investments, luxury properties, political influence, and international partnerships. Very few mentioned family. Even fewer mentioned kindness. During the afternoon coffee break, she noticed Adaobi standing near the balcony, speaking with two influential investors. Her confidence was remarkable. She spoke fluently about global markets and corporate law. The investors listened attentively. Janet understood immediately why Chinedu admired her. Adaobi possessed intelligence, elegance, and extraordinary ambition. Had Janet only observed this public performance, she might have approved of the young lawyer herself. Then the coffee station became crowded. One elderly janitor accidentally brushed against Adaobi's expensive handbag while replacing a trash bag. The man's hands shook noticeably. I'm terribly sorry. Adaobi looked at the tiny stain on the leather. This bag costs more than your yearly salary. The old janitor lowered his head. I apologize. She sighed dramatically. You people should know your place. Several nearby guests heard the comment. Nobody responded. The janitor quietly continued working. Janet watched every second. The investors standing beside Adaobi simply smiled awkwardly before changing the subject. Status, protected, cruelty. Again. Before leaving, Adaobi handed the janitor a small banknote. Buy yourself better training. To anyone watching casually, it appeared generous. But Janet had seen the humiliation that came first. Money could not erase disrespect. Later that afternoon, another familiar face entered the hotel. Kelechi had been invited to receive an educational award for her outstanding work in underprivileged schools. Unlike many attendees, she seemed uncomfortable among so many wealthy executives. She greeted everyone politely without trying to impress anyone. After the ceremony ended, the guests moved toward the dining hall. Mama Ngozi intentionally dropped a stack of clean towels across the corridor. The piles scattered everywhere. Many guests stepped around her without slowing down. Some pretended not to notice. One businessman even frowned because the towels blocked his path. Then Kelechi arrived. Oh, Mama. Without hesitation, she knelt on the polished floor. I'll help. It's all right. No. She gathered every towel carefully before placing them back on the cart. As she stood, she noticed Janet breathing heavily. You've been working since morning. Janet nodded. These conferences are exhausting. Kelechi smiled warmly. My students always complain when I tell them hard work builds character. And do they believe you? Not yet. Both women laughed softly. One hotel supervisor approached impatiently. Kelechi, your car is waiting. She nodded. I'll be there in a minute. The supervisor glanced at Janet. She'll finish eventually. Kelechi answered politely. I know. Then she turned back to Janet. Please don't skip lunch. Janet watched her walk away. Simple concern, no performance, no calculation. That evening, Chukwudi attended a community reading program sponsored by the Nwosu Foundation. The event encouraged children from disadvantaged neighborhoods to develop stronger reading habits. As executive director, he insisted on participating personally rather than sending representatives. When he arrived, dozens of children surrounded him with excitement. He spent nearly 2 hours reading stories, answering questions, and laughing with them. Near the back of the classroom, another volunteer was organizing books. It was Kelechi. neither expected to meet there. "You volunteer here too?" Chukwudi asked. She smiled. "Every Thursday." "I've never seen you." "I usually work in the younger children's room." They spent the afternoon together without discussing wealth or careers. Instead, they talked about education, families, books they loved during childhood, dreams for the next generation. When the program ended, Chukwudi realized something surprising. He had completely forgotten who she was socially. For 2 hours, she had simply been another person trying to help children. As they walked toward the parking area, heavy clouds gathered overhead. Rain began falling suddenly. Most volunteers hurried toward their cars. One little boy remained standing outside, crying. His bicycle chain had broken. His mother had not yet arrived. Without hesitation, Kelechi knelt beside the bicycle. "I think we can fix this." Her hands quickly became covered with grease. Chukwudi looked around. "Should I call someone?" She shook her head. "Hold the wheel." Together they repaired the chain. The little boy smiled proudly before riding away. Only after he disappeared did Chukwudi notice grease covering Kelechi's dress. "You ruined your clothes," she laughed. "They're washable." "You weren't worried." She looked genuinely confused. "Worried about what?" "The dress." She smiled again. "I was thinking about the child." For the first time in many months, Chukwudi found himself speechless. Across the city, Chinedu was having dinner with Adaobi. The restaurant overlooked the Lagos Lagoon. Everything appeared elegant. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath soft lights. Live musicians played quietly nearby. "You've been distracted lately," Adaobi observed. Chinedu smiled apologetically. "Business. You work too much." "So do you." She reached across the table. "We understand each other." Chinedu believed she was right. They spoke comfortably about future investments, international travel luxury homes, and expanding the Nwosu group across Africa. Their visions seemed perfectly aligned, yet neither conversation included ordinary people. Neither mentioned helping others. Neither touched on sacrifice. As the evening ended, an elderly flower seller approached their table. "Please, sir." She held out a single rose. Adaobi frowned immediately. "Not now." The woman looked at Chinedu hopefully. Before he could answer, Adaobi waved security over. "She's bothering customers." The guards escorted the elderly seller away. Chinedu watched silently. Something about the moment unsettled him. He could not explain why. Back inside her apartment, Janet reviewed everything she had witnessed over the past several weeks. Patterns were becoming impossible to ignore. Adaobi impressed powerful people effortlessly. Kelechi impressed those who had no power at all. One woman treated kindness like a performance. The other treated kindness like breathing. Janet closed her notebook. The investigation was no longer about choosing between two women. It was becoming a test of whether her own sons could recognize genuine character before it was too late. A month passed, and the lives of the two Nwosu brothers slowly began moving in different directions, without either of them realizing it. Although they still worked together every day at the Nwosu Group headquarters, their evenings became increasingly occupied by different people. Chinedu spent more time with Adaobi. Chukwudi found himself looking forward to every opportunity to see Kelechi. Janet, still living as Mama Nwosu, quietly followed both paths from a distance. She never interfered. She only observed. One Monday morning, Chinedu invited Adaobi to tour the company's new headquarters before its official opening. The 30-story glass building overlooked Victoria Island and represented one of the largest investments in the company's history. As they entered the lobby, employees greeted Chinedu respectfully. "Good morning, sir." He smiled warmly. "Good morning." Adaobi walked proudly beside him, clearly enjoying the attention. During the tour, she asked intelligent questions about company operations, international expansion, and investment strategies. Her business knowledge genuinely impressed Chinedu. "You understand corporate management surprisingly well," he said. She smiled confidently. "My father always taught me that knowledge is more valuable than beauty." "I agree." She looked around the magnificent executive floor. "You've built something extraordinary." "My parents built it. You'll make it even greater." Her words filled Chinedu with confidence. As they entered a conference room, a young receptionist accidentally dropped a tray of bottled water onto the carpet. The loud crash startled everyone. The receptionist immediately knelt. "I'm sorry, sir." Before Chinedu could answer, Adaobi spoke sharply. "Do people receive training before working here?" The young woman lowered her head. "Yes, ma'am." "It doesn't look like it." Chinedu noticed the receptionist's trembling hands. "It's all right," he said gently. "Everyone makes mistakes." The receptionist thanked him repeatedly. Adobe remained silent, though disappointment showed clearly on her face. Later, after leaving the building, she sighed. "You're too forgiving." He looked surprised. "Why? Leaders need standards. They also need compassion." Adeobi smiled politely, but said nothing more. The conversation lingered in Chinedu's mind longer than he expected. Across the city, Chukwudi was visiting a public primary school funded by the Nwosu Foundation. The classrooms needed repairs before the rainy season. Several volunteers had already arrived. Among them was Kelechi. She stood on a ladder, decorating a classroom wall with colorful educational posters, while children gathered around excitedly. When she noticed Chukwudi entering, she smiled. "I thought businessmen hated paint." "We do." "So why are you here?" "Because someone promised these children we'd help." She laughed. "Good answer." Throughout the day, they worked side by side. Neither cared that their clothes became covered with dust and paint. They repaired broken desks, installed bookshelves, planted flowers near the entrance. During lunch, they sat beneath a large mango tree while children played football nearby. For several minutes, they simply watched the game. Finally, Chukwudi asked quietly, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you become a teacher?" Kelechi looked toward the children. "My father couldn't read." She paused. "He spent his entire life believing education belonged only to rich families." "What happened?" "He worked every job he could find just so my brothers and I could stay in school." Her smile softened. "When he died, I promised myself I'd help children whose parents made the same sacrifices." Chukwudi listened carefully. "You've never wanted a higher-paying career?" She laughed softly. "Every teacher asks themselves that question. And I realized happiness and income aren't always the same thing." Her answer stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Later that afternoon, a sudden rainstorm forced everyone inside one of the classrooms. The roof leaked badly in several places. Children quickly moved their books away from the dripping water. Without hesitation, Kelechi climbed onto a chair and covered the damaged section with a temporary plastic sheet. Water soaked her hair and clothes. One volunteer shouted, "You'll get sick." She smiled. "The books are more important." Chukwudi found himself staring at her. Not because she looked beautiful, but because everything she did seemed genuine. There was no audience, no cameras, no publicity. Just instinctive kindness. Meanwhile, Janet continued gathering information as Mama Ngozi. That week, she accepted temporary work inside an exclusive country club frequently visited by Lagos's wealthiest families. The club employed dozens of cleaners, gardeners' cooks, and maintenance workers. Most members barely noticed them. Janet did. During one busy afternoon, she overheard two waitresses talking quietly. Did you hear? Hear what? Mr. Chinedu Nwosu is coming today. With that lawyer. Yes. Janet quietly continued polishing nearby windows. An hour later, Chinedu and Adobe arrived. The staff welcomed them warmly. Lunch proceeded pleasantly until an elderly groundskeeper accidentally sprayed a little water onto Adobe's shoes while trimming flowers. The old man apologized immediately. I'm very sorry. Adobe looked down at her expensive heels. These shoes were imported. The gardener bowed repeatedly. I'll clean them. You couldn't afford to replace them. Janet noticed several employees exchanging uncomfortable glances. Chinedu finally stepped forward. It's only water. Adobe forced a smile. I know. But her expression revealed irritation. After the gardener walked away, Chinedu spoke quietly. I think you were too harsh. She looked surprised. I was protecting my property. He made an honest mistake. She crossed her arms. People become careless when nobody corrects them. Chinedu did not answer. For the first time, doubt entered his mind. Only a tiny seed. But it had been planted. 2 days later, Chukwudi invited Kelechi to visit a community library project that had recently opened. As they walked through the neighborhood, they encountered an elderly woman struggling to carry 2 heavy bags of vegetables. Without hesitation, Kelechi stopped. Mama, let me help. Oh no, it's all right. She carried both bags, nearly 3 streets to the woman's home. The elderly woman thanked her repeatedly. Chukwudi smiled. You seem to know everyone. I don't. Then why help? She looked genuinely puzzled. Wouldn't you? He hesitated. I hope so. She smiled warmly. I think you already would. Her confidence embarrassed him slightly. That evening, Chukwudi drove home alone. Traffic moved slowly across Third Mainland Bridge. Instead of thinking about business reports or investment meetings, he kept replaying small moments from the past few weeks. Kelechi fixing bicycles, helping strangers, protecting books from rain, carrying vegetables, comforting children. None of those moments had been extraordinary by themselves. Together, however, they painted the portrait of someone remarkable. Back inside her apartment, Janet carefully reviewed another page of observations. Her notebook was becoming thicker, the evidence clearer. One son was slowly falling in love with appearances. The other was unknowingly falling in love with character. Janet closed the notebook and whispered to herself, the hardest part is still ahead. Because discovering the truth had never been her greatest challenge. Finding the right moment to reveal it without breaking her family apart would require far more courage than putting on a disguise. The notebook Janet kept beneath the loose floorboard of her apartment was almost half full. Each page contained dates, places, conversations, and quiet observations. She never exaggerated. She never judged a person after only one encounter. Instead, she searched for patterns. A person's real character she believed was never revealed in a single moment. It emerged through consistent choices made when nobody expected anything in return. So, she decided it was time for more difficult tests. Not to trap anyone, but to create ordinary situations where kindness or selfishness would appear naturally. On Tuesday morning, Mama Ngozi accepted another temporary cleaning assignment at an upscale shopping mall where several luxury brands had recently opened new stores. She intentionally walked a little slower than usual, leaning heavily on an old wooden cane. Around lunchtime, she stopped near the central escalator and pretended to lose her balance. Her shopping bag slipped from her hand. A few oranges rolled across the polished floor. Several shoppers glanced briefly before continuing toward expensive boutiques. One young man stepped over the fruit without slowing down. A middle-aged woman frowned because one orange rolled near her shoes. Nobody stopped. Then Adobe appeared. She had been shopping with two friends and carried several elegant shopping bags. One of her friends noticed the elderly woman. "Should we help her?" Adeobi barely looked in Janet's direction. "There are cleaners for that." The three women continued walking. One orange rolled directly into Adeobi's path. She gently pushed it aside with the tip of her shoe and disappeared into a jewelry store. Janet slowly gathered the scattered fruit by herself. No anger crossed her face, only quiet disappointment. 20 minutes later, another familiar figure entered the mall. Kelechi had come to buy classroom supplies using money collected by fellow teachers. She immediately noticed Mama Ngozi kneeling on the floor. "Oh, Mama," she hurried over. "Please don't move." Within seconds, she had collected every orange. "Did you fall?" "A little." "Are you hurt?" "I'll be all right." Kelechi examined Janet's hands. A small scrape appeared near one knuckle. Without hesitation, she opened her handbag, removed a packet of antiseptic wipes, and carefully cleaned the wound. "You always carry these?" Janet asked. "I teach children." She smiled. "Somebody gets injured almost every day." Janet laughed softly. "That makes sense." Kelechi then helped her onto a nearby bench. "Wait here." "You don't have to. I'll be right back." A few minutes later, she returned carrying a bottle of water. "I already bought what I needed." Janet knew that wasn't true. The classroom supplies had been forgotten. Helping another person had become more important. Before leaving, Kelechi gently squeezed her shoulder. "Please be careful walking alone." Janet watched her disappear into the crowd. Another quiet note formed inside her mind. Compassion interrupts plans without resentment. Later that week, Janet arranged another opportunity. Through trusted employees, she organized interviews for volunteers who wished to mentor teenagers from disadvantaged communities. Both Adobe and Kelechi accepted invitations. Neither knew the interviews were part of Janet's growing investigation. Mama Ngozi was assigned to serve tea throughout the day. The first interview belonged to Adobe. She entered wearing an elegant cream suit and greeted the committee confidently. Her answers sounded impressive. She spoke about leadership, success, professional excellence, discipline. Everything appeared flawless. During a short break, Janet intentionally spilled a cup of tea near Adeobi's chair. "Oh!" The tea splashed onto the floor. "I'm terribly sorry." Adeobi immediately stood. "Do you realize this suit is custom made?" "I apologize." "You should be more careful." Janet reached for a cloth. "My eyesight isn't as good as before." Adeobi sighed impatiently. "Maybe it's time you retired." Several committee members looked uncomfortable. Janet quietly cleaned the floor. Not one apology came from Adeobi afterward. The interview resumed as though nothing had happened. An hour later, it was Kelechi's turn. Her interview differed completely. She spoke honestly about the struggles facing many children. Some arrived at school hungry. Others shared one textbook among 4 classmates. Many lacked electricity to study at night. She admitted she did not have solutions for every problem. But I believe every child deserves at least one adult who never gives up on them. The committee listened silently. When the interview ended, Mama Ngozi carried another tray of tea into the room. This time, Janet deliberately allowed one cup to tip over. Tea spread across the table. Kelechi reacted immediately. "Mama, don't worry." She grabbed several napkins. Together, they cleaned the spill. Then she smiled. "I've made much bigger messes in my classroom." Everyone laughed. The atmosphere relaxed instantly. One committee member quietly observed the difference between the two women. Janet noticed him writing something in his notebook. That evening, Chinedu invited Adobe to dinner at his favorite rooftop restaurant. The city lights stretched endlessly beneath them. Everything seemed perfect. Adeobi looked stunning. The music was soft. The conversation flowed easily. Halfway through dinner, their waiter accidentally served the wrong dessert. "I'm so sorry." Before Chinedu could respond, Adaobi frowned. "We didn't order this." "I'll replace it immediately." The waiter hurried away. Chinedu smiled. "It's not a big problem." Adaobi shook her head. "If people aren't corrected, standards decline." He looked thoughtfully toward the nervous waiter. "Everyone deserves patience." She changed the subject, but something inside Chinedu refused to move on so quickly. For the first time since they met, he wondered whether they viewed the world differently. Across Lagos, Chukwudi and Kelechi spent Saturday morning helping renovate a shelter for abandoned elderly women. The building needed fresh paint. Broken windows required replacement. Several volunteers arrived before sunrise. Mama Ngozi quietly joined them. Nobody recognized her. Throughout the morning, Janet observed Kelechi moving from one task to another. She carried paint buckets, prepared meals, comforted lonely residents. Even while exhausted, she smiled sincerely. During lunch, one elderly woman accidentally dropped her bowl of soup onto the floor. She immediately burst into tears. "I'm sorry." "It's all right," Kelechi said gently. "I'll get another bowl." The old woman whispered, "I always make trouble." Kelechi knelt beside her. "No." She took the woman's trembling hands. "You remind me of my grandmother." The elderly resident smiled through tears. Janet had to look away. The moment touched her more deeply than she expected. There had been no audience, no wealthy family watching, no possibility of reward, only genuine compassion. As the volunteers prepared to leave, one of the shelter managers quietly approached Janet. "Your granddaughter is wonderful." Janet smiled behind her disguise. "She isn't my granddaughter." The manager looked surprised. "She treats you like family." Janet felt unexpected emotion rise inside her chest. "Yes," she answered softly. "She really does." That night, she returned home carrying the heaviest heart she had experienced since beginning the investigation. Her notebook now contained overwhelming evidence. Every carefully planned situation produced the same result. Adaobi valued image. Kelechi valued people. Janet had discovered the truth she had been searching for. But another question now haunted her. Would her sons recognize it before one of them made the greatest mistake of his life? She closed the notebook, extinguished the light, and stared into the darkness. The tests were almost over. The consequences were only beginning. The annual Nwosu Foundation Gala had become one of the most anticipated charity events in Lagos. Every year, business leaders, government officials, celebrities, and non-profit organizations gathered under one roof to raise millions of naira for hospitals, schools, and rural development projects. It was more than a fundraiser. It was a social event where reputations were built, partnerships were formed, and countless eyes watched every conversation. This year felt different. With Janet Nwosu officially away on her extended retreat, her twin sons would host the gala for the first time, without their mother. The media immediately focused on another topic. Which woman would eventually become the future Mrs. Nwosu? Long before sunset luxury cars lined the entrance. Journalists crowded behind security barriers. Photographers shouted the names of arriving guests. Inside the ballroom, Chukwudi wore a classic black tuxedo and welcomed guests with his usual quiet smile. Beside him stood Chinedu, equally elegant and noticeably more confident beneath the flashing cameras. Although the brothers looked almost identical, people who knew them well could easily distinguish them. Chukwudi greeted every waiter by name. Chinedu greeted every investor by name. Neither approach was wrong. They simply valued different things. Across the ballroom, Adaobi entered. wearing a breathtaking emerald evening gown that immediately attracted every camera in the room. She carried herself with effortless confidence. Within minutes, reporters surrounded her. "Miss Okafor. This way." One photo. She smiled gracefully for every picture. Not far behind, Kelechi quietly entered, wearing a simple navy blue dress. She had borrowed the dress from a fellow teacher because she owned nothing suitable for such an elegant occasion. No photographers noticed her. She smiled anyway. Mama Ngozi had already arrived hours earlier. Dressed in a faded housekeeping uniform, she quietly polished mirrors, arranged chairs, and replaced table decorations. Hundreds of influential guests walked past her without a second glance. Exactly as she expected. As the evening officially began, Chinedu delivered a welcoming speech. He thanked donors, recognized volunteers, announced several new educational initiatives. The audience applauded warmly. Afterward, guests mingled throughout the ballroom while musicians played softly. Janet remained near one side of the room, pretending to clean decorative windows while watching everything unfold. It did not take long. Adobe moved gracefully from one influential guest to another. She remembered names, complimented achievements, discussed investment opportunities. Every conversation strengthened her social position. She understood networking exceptionally well. Nearby, Kelechi spoke with several school principals about literacy programs in rural communities. Instead of discussing herself, she asked questions about children, teachers, and families. Her conversations attracted far less attention, yet they felt far more sincere. Later in the evening, one of the event coordinators approached Kelechi. "We're short of volunteers serving dessert. I can help." "But you're a guest." She smiled. "They need help." Without another word, she walked into the service area. Janet watched silently. No one had asked Adobe for help. No one expected Kelechi to volunteer. The difference came entirely from their own choices. Half an hour later, dessert service began. The ballroom remained crowded. Waiters moved carefully between tables, carrying expensive crystal plates. Kelechi quietly assisted by delivering desserts wherever staff became overwhelmed. Several guests assumed she worked there. She never corrected them. Then came the moment Janet had not planned. A wealthy socialite sitting near the front table looked directly at Kelechi. "Excuse me." Kelechi approached politely. "Yes, ma'am. My coffee is cold. I'll replace it." As Kelechi turned toward the kitchen, another guest whispered loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "I thought she was one of the women trying to marry into the Nwosu family." Several people laughed. Another woman smiled sarcastically. "Maybe she's practicing." The laughter spread. Kelechi stopped walking. For a brief moment, Janet saw pain flash across the young teacher's face. Then it disappeared. She simply smiled. "I'll bring your coffee." She continued walking. Janet felt her heart ache. Humiliation revealed character more clearly than praise ever could. Several minutes later, Chukwudi entered the service corridor searching for bottled water. He found Kelechi carrying a tray. "What are you doing?" "Helping." "You're supposed to enjoy the evening." She laughed softly. "I am." He noticed the sadness lingering behind her smile. "Did something happen?" She hesitated. "No." He knew she was hiding something. Before he could ask again, another volunteer called for assistance. Kelechi excused herself. The conversation ended unfinished. Meanwhile, Adobe had gathered several influential guests around one of the auction displays. Her charm captivated everyone. She effortlessly persuaded two businessmen to double their donations. Even Chinedu looked impressed. "You always know exactly what to say." She smiled proudly. "It's important to understand people." Standing nearby, Janet quietly whispered to herself, "No. It's important to value them." Later that evening, the foundation announced its largest donor of the year. To everyone's surprise, the award went not to a billionaire, but to a retired school principal who had donated nearly all of his retirement savings to build village libraries. The elderly man slowly walked toward the stage using a cane. The audience applauded respectfully. As he descended the steps after receiving his plaque, he stumbled. His cane slipped. He began falling forwards. Everything happened within seconds. Dozens of wealthy guests watched. Nobody moved. Adaobi instinctively stepped backward to protect her gown. Chinedu froze in surprise. Across the room, Kelechi immediately ran forwards. She caught the elderly man before he struck the floor. The applause stopped. Complete silence filled the ballroom. "It's all right." She steadied him gently. "I've got you." The old principal smiled gratefully. "My legs aren't what they used to be." She adjusted his cane. "They've carried you far enough." The audience erupted into applause, this time not because of the donation, because of compassion. Chukwudi watched the entire scene. Something changed inside him. It wasn't admiration, it was certainty. The certainty that genuine kindness could never be rehearsed. Across the ballroom, Chinedu also witnessed everything. He glanced briefly toward Adobe. She was clapping politely, but her attention had already shifted back toward an influential senator standing nearby. She had missed the true significance of the moment. Near midnight, the gala finally ended. Guests slowly departed. Staff began cleaning. Mama Ngozi quietly pushed her cleaning cart across the nearly empty ballroom. As she passed one of the tables, she overheard two waitresses whispering, "The teacher is wonderful." "I know. I thought rich people were supposed to act like that." The other waitress smiled sadly. "Sometimes the poorest hearts wear the most expensive clothes." Janet paused. The sentence settled deeply inside her. Outside, Chukwudi offered to drive Kelechi home. They walked slowly toward the parking area. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, he said quietly, "You never told me what happened earlier." She smiled faintly. "It wasn't important. It mattered to you." She looked at him. "There will always be people who judge others by appearance. And you don't change who you are because of them." Chukwudi smiled. "I hope I remember that." Across the parking lot, Chinedu opened the passenger door for Adobe. As they drove away, she looked back at the brightly lit ballroom. "What a successful evening!" Chinedu nodded. "Yes." But for reasons he couldn't yet explain, success no longer seemed like the most important thing he had witnessed that night. Back inside the empty ballroom, Janet stood alone beneath the glittering chandeliers. The distance between her sons had quietly grown larger. One was beginning to see with his heart. The other was still seeing with his eyes. And the most painful chapter of her secret mission had only just begun. The morning after the charity gala, Janet sat quietly inside her small apartment with her notebook resting on the kitchen table. She slowly reread every page she had written during the past several weeks. The evidence had become overwhelming. Adeobi consistently treated influential people with warmth while showing impatience toward those she believed had nothing to offer. Kelechi showed the same kindness regardless of whether she was speaking to a billionaire or a street cleaner. The contrast had become impossible to ignore. Yet Janet understood one painful truth. She knew the evidence because she had witnessed it herself. Her sons had not, especially Chinedu. If she confronted him now, he would almost certainly believe she had misunderstood Adobe. A mother protecting one son could easily appear unfair to the other. Janet needed one final test, one that would happen in public, one that neither son could dismiss. 3 days later, the Nwosu Foundation organized a community health outreach in one of Lagos's oldest neighborhoods. Doctors volunteered to provide free medical examinations. Volunteers distributed food packages, blankets, and medicine. The event attracted hundreds of local residents. It also attracted many wealthy donors who wished to be seen supporting charitable causes. Mama Ngozi arrived early, wearing her faded dress and carrying several boxes of bottled water. She quietly helped arrange chairs beneath temporary tents. Nobody recognized her. Around 10 o'clock, luxury vehicles began arriving. Among the first guests were Chinedu and Adobe. Minutes later, Chukwudi arrived with Kelechi. Unlike most visitors, Kelechi immediately joined the volunteers instead of walking toward the VIP reception area. She helped elderly residents register for medical examinations. She comforted frightened children waiting to see doctors. She carried folding chairs without being asked. Janet smiled quietly. Some habits never required instruction. As the event continued, she noticed an empty wheelchair positioned near one of the tents. An idea formed immediately. She walked slowly across the crowded field, intentionally pretending to feel dizzy. Her breathing became heavier. She leaned harder on her cane. Several volunteers noticed her. "You all right, Mama?" "I'll be fine." She took another step, then deliberately allowed herself to collapse onto the dusty ground. Her walking cane rolled several meters away. The nearby crowd reacted with surprise. Some people stopped walking. Others simply watched. Janet remained lying motionless. She wanted to see who would act first. Only seconds passed. But those seconds revealed everything. Adobe looked toward the fallen woman from across the field. She frowned. "There are medical volunteers." One of her friends nodded. "They'll handle it." Neither woman moved. Instead, they continued discussing an upcoming charity auction. Chinedu turned toward the commotion. He hesitated. Just before taking a step forward, one businessman stopped him. "Mr. Nwosu, the commissioner wants to meet you." Chinedu glanced once more toward the crowd. Doctors were already beginning to gather. He convinced himself everything was under control. Then he followed the businessman. Across the field, Kelechi saw the elderly woman fall. She dropped the registration clipboard immediately. Without thinking, she ran. "Mama." She knelt beside Janet. "Can you hear me?" Janet opened her eyes weakly. "My chest." Kelechi gently supported her shoulders. "Someone call a doctor." Several volunteers hurried over. One doctor quickly examined Janet. "She'll be all right." "Just exhaustion." Kelechi exhaled with relief. The doctor smiled. "Thank you for getting here so quickly." She simply nodded. "There were many people closer than me." The doctor looked around. Sometimes being close isn't the same as caring. Those words lingered in Janet's mind. After resting for several minutes, Janet insisted she was strong enough to sit beneath one of the tents. Kelechi refused to leave. "You should continue helping." "I can wait." "You've already done enough." She smiled gently. "I don't think kindness has a time limit." Janet almost laughed. Even after weeks of observation, the young woman continued surprising her. Half an hour later, the outreach program resumed normally. Children laughed while receiving school supplies. Doctors examined elderly patients. Families collected food parcels. Everything appeared peaceful. Then, another unexpected situation unfolded. One elderly widower arrived carrying his sick grandson. The child had a high fever. Unfortunately, registration had already closed because the doctors were overwhelmed. The grandfather looked desperate. "My grandson has been sick all night." The volunteer at the registration desk apologized. "I'm sorry. We've reached capacity." The old man lowered his head. "I walked nearly 3 hours." Nearby, donors quietly continued their conversations. Some glanced briefly toward the elderly man. Nobody stepped forward. Kelechi overheard the discussion. Without hesitation, she approached one of the physicians. "Doctor." The physician looked up. "Yes. Would you please see one more patient? We've already exceeded today's schedule." "I understand." She looked toward the feverish child. "But I don't think he'll understand." The doctor followed her gaze. Several silent seconds passed. Finally, he smiled. "Bring him." The elderly grandfather's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." Kelechi shook her head. "Thank the doctor." Janet watched the exchange carefully. Kelechi had not demanded special treatment. She had simply asked with compassion. The doctor later admitted privately that he had planned to leave immediately. But Kelechi's sincerity changed his mind. As afternoon approached, heavy clouds covered the sky. Rain began falling unexpectedly. Volunteers rushed to protect medical equipment. Patients crowded beneath temporary shelters. A strong gust of wind suddenly lifted part of one tent. Metal poles leaned dangerously. Several elderly patients struggled to stand. Without hesitation, Chukwudi and Kelechi ran toward the collapsing shelter together. They grabbed the support poles before they could fall. Other volunteers quickly joined them. Within moments, the structure was secured safely. Chinedu also arrived seconds later after hearing the shouting. He immediately helped move elderly patients to another tent. Working together, the brothers restored order within minutes. When the emergency finally ended, everyone applauded. The crisis had been avoided. Janet quietly noticed something important. During genuine emergencies, both sons possessed good hearts. The difference appeared before the emergency. Chukwudi naturally noticed people. Chinedu often noticed situations only after someone else reacted first. That distinction troubled her deeply. As the rain gradually stopped, volunteers began packing equipment. Patients returned home. Children waved goodbye. The outreach had been considered a tremendous success. Before leaving, Chinedu walked beside Adobe toward the parking area. "I didn't see you much today." "I spent time with several sponsors. We helped many families." She smiled. "That's what matters." He nodded slowly. For reasons he couldn't explain, her answer felt strangely incomplete. Nearby, Chukwudi thanked Kelechi for volunteering. "You've been on your feet since sunrise." She laughed. "So have you. You should rest." "I will." She looked around at the smiling families leaving with medicine and food. But today was worth being tired. Those simple words stayed with Chukwudi all the way home. That evening, Janet returned to her apartment soaked from the rain. She removed her gray wig and carefully opened her notebook again. She no longer needed additional evidence. The investigation itself was finished. Now came something far more difficult. She had to decide how to reveal the truth without destroying the trust her son still had in her. Outside her window, thunder echoed across Lagos. Janet closed the notebook gently. The storm in the sky would soon pass. The storm waiting inside the Nwosu family had only begun. The morning after the community health outreach, Janet made a decision she had been postponing for weeks. The investigation was over. Every page in her notebook pointed toward the same conclusion. If she continued watching silently, nothing would change. The only remaining question was how to reveal the truth without pushing her family further apart. She understood her sons better than anyone. If she simply removed her disguise and announced that Adobe lacked compassion, Chinedu would immediately become defensive. He loved evidence. He hated accusations. He needed to discover the truth himself. Janet smiled thoughtfully. Then she remembered an old lesson her late husband had often repeated. Never tell someone what they refuse to see. Create the opportunity for them to see it with their own eyes. That would become her final test. Later that morning, Chukwudi invited Kelechi to lunch at a small restaurant overlooking the Lagos Marina. Unlike the luxurious places his brother preferred, this restaurant was known for its quiet atmosphere and homemade food. There were no photographers, no influential politicians, no business reporters, only ordinary families enjoying their weekend. As they waited for their meals, Chukwudi looked unusually nervous. Kelechi noticed immediately. "You've been quiet." "I have," she smiled. "You've stirred your tea for almost 5 minutes." He laughed awkwardly and finally put down the spoon. "I've been thinking. About work. About life." She raised an eyebrow playfully. "That sounds serious." He looked directly at her. "Can I ask you something personal? If I can answer it. What does success mean to you?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched a father helping his young daughter cut a piece of grilled fish. Only after several moments did she speak. "When I was little, I thought success meant becoming rich. And now, I think success is sleeping peacefully because nobody suffered for your happiness." Chukwudi remained silent. Her answer was so simple, yet it carried a depth that few executives he knew could ever express. "What about you?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "I used to think success meant expanding my father's company. And now, I'm not sure anymore." She laughed softly. "Ew, that's all right." "Why?" "The best answers usually take time." Across Lagos, Chinedu attended an exclusive investment luncheon with Adobe. The private club overlooked a championship golf course. Several foreign investors had traveled from London and Dubai to discuss potential partnerships with the Nwosu group. Adobe impressed everyone. She spoke confidently about mergers, legal structures, and international expansion. The investors clearly admired her intelligence. During lunch, one elderly waitress accidentally placed sparkling water instead of still water beside Adobe. The mistake was corrected almost immediately. "I'm terribly sorry," Adobe sighed. "I specifically requested still water." "I'll replace it right away." The waitress hurried away. One foreign investor smiled politely. "It happens." Adobe nodded. "It shouldn't." Chinedu glanced toward the elderly waitress. She looked embarrassed. He quietly thanked her when she returned with the correct bottle. She smiled gratefully. The small moment lasted only seconds. But once again, Chinedu noticed the contrast between his own reaction and Adobe's. For the first time, the pattern no longer seemed like coincidence. Meanwhile, Janet began preparing the final stage of her plan. She contacted only 3 people she trusted completely: her longtime attorney, her personal secretary, and retired Justice Ngozi Obi. All 3 had known the truth from the beginning. They met inside the lawyer's private office after business hours. Janet removed her gray wig before sitting down. Her secretary smiled with relief. "I've missed seeing your real face." Janet laughed quietly. "So have I." The attorney opened a folder. "You've gathered enough evidence." "I have." Justice Ngozi studied Janet carefully. "And are you satisfied?" Janet hesitated. "No." The room became silent. "I found exactly what I feared." She placed the thick notebook on the conference table. "One woman loves influence." She rested her hand gently on the cover. "The other loves people." The attorney nodded. "So, what happens now?" Janet looked toward the window overlooking the city. "My sons must choose their futures." Justice Ngozi asked softly, "Will you tell them everything?" "Not yet." "Why?" "Yeah. Because if I reveal the disguise too early, Chinedu will believe I manipulated the results." She paused. He must reach the truth himself. The retired judge smiled. "Your husband would have approved." Janet lowered her eyes. "I hope so." That evening, both brothers happened to arrive at the family mansion at nearly the same time. Dinner had been prepared by the household staff. Without their mother present, the enormous dining room felt strangely empty. They sat across from each other. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Chukwudi broke the silence. "You've been spending a lot of time with Adobe." Chinedu smiled. "I could say the same about Kelechi." They both laughed. It reminded them of childhood, before business responsibilities had complicated everything. After a while, Chinedu asked casually, "What do you think of Adobe?" Chukwudi answered honestly. "She's intelligent." "Very." "She's ambitious." "I admire that." Chukwudi nodded slowly. Then he added, "I just don't know her very well." "What about Kelechi?" Chinedu thought for a moment. "I've only met her a few times. And she seems different." "Different how?" He searched for the right words. "I don't think she notices whether someone is important." Chukwudi smiled. "That's exactly what I like about her." The conversation drifted toward work. Neither brother realized how significant those few sentences would later become. Across the city, Janet sat alone inside her apartment, looking through an old family photo album. One picture showed Emeka holding the twins when they were only 5 years old. Another captured all 4 of them, planting trees together during one of the company's first charity projects. She gently touched the photograph. "You always believed they'd become good men." A tear rolled down her cheek. "They have." She smiled sadly. "But being good men doesn't always mean making wise choices." She closed the album. The hardest part of motherhood, she realized, was not protecting children from pain. It was allowing them to face difficult truths that would help them grow. The following morning, Janet received unexpected news from her secretary. Chinedu had privately purchased an engagement ring. The jeweler confirmed it would be ready within 2 weeks. Janet remained completely still. She had expected the relationship to progress. She simply had not expected it so quickly. If Chinedu proposed before learning the truth, everything she had sacrificed would become meaningless. She thanked her secretary, ended the call, and looked toward the notebook one final time. The time for silent observation had ended. The final chapter of her secret mission was about to begin. Janet barely slept that night. The news that Chinedu had secretly purchased an engagement ring echoed through her mind until dawn. She had prepared herself for many possibilities, but she had underestimated how quickly emotions could outrun wisdom. She stood beside the small window of her apartment and watched the first rays of sunlight spread across Lagos. Time was no longer on her side. If she revealed herself too soon, Chinedu would believe she had manipulated every situation. If she waited too long, he might propose before discovering Adeobi's true character. Neither choice felt right. She whispered softly into the empty room. "Emeka, help me." Her late husband's photograph rested on the shelf beside the window. His familiar smile seemed almost reassuring. After several quiet minutes, Janet reached for her notebook once more. She did not reread every page. Instead, she turned to the final blank sheet and wrote only one sentence. The last lesson must reveal itself naturally. She closed the notebook. That afternoon, the Nwosu group held its quarterly leadership meeting. Executives from every division gathered inside the headquarters' largest conference room. Although Janet was officially still abroad, her absence had become increasingly noticeable. Several board members privately wondered when she would return. Chinedu chaired the meeting with confidence. His presentation on international expansion received enthusiastic approval. Even senior executives complimented his leadership. Across the table, Chukwudi focused on community investment reports rather than financial projections. The contrast between the brothers had become obvious to everyone. After the meeting ended, one elderly maintenance worker entered the room pushing a cleaning cart. He quietly began collecting empty coffee cups. Several executives walked past him without acknowledgement. One director accidentally knocked a folder onto the floor. The maintenance worker immediately bent down to retrieve it. Before he could stand, another executive impatiently reached across him to collect his briefcase, nearly causing the old man to lose his balance. No apology followed. Chukwudi noticed. He immediately walked over. "Please let me help." Together they gathered the scattered papers. The maintenance worker smiled gratefully. "Thank you, sir." Chukwudi shook his head. "You're helping us every day." The elderly man laughed. "I suppose we help each other." Standing near the doorway, Chinedu watched the exchange thoughtfully. Small moments like these had begun affecting him more than he cared to admit. Later that afternoon, Adaobi invited Chinedu to visit a luxury housing development overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Elegant villas lined quiet streets. Private gardens surrounded every home. As they toured one of the model houses, Adaobi admired the marble floors and enormous windows. "This would be perfect." "For what?" Chinedu asked. "Our future." He smiled. "You've already planned it." She laughed confidently. "I believe in planning ahead." She walked into the master bedroom. "The view is incredible." "It is." She turned toward him. "We would entertain important people here." She pointed toward the dining room. "And charity galas could be hosted in the garden." Everything she described sounded impressive. Yet Chinedu noticed something strange. She spoke constantly about appearances, status, influence, prestige. She never mentioned family dinners, children, simple happiness. The realization unsettled him. He tried pushing the thought aside. Instead, it remained. Meanwhile, Chukwudi received a phone call from Kelechi. One of her students had been hospitalized unexpectedly after collapsing during class. The child's widowed mother could not afford medication. "I'm heading to the hospital," Kelechi explained. "I'll come with you." "You don't have to." "I know." 20 minutes later, they arrived at the crowded public hospital. The mother sat outside the pediatric ward, crying quietly. Kelechi immediately knelt beside her. "How is he?" "They're treating him." "But I don't have enough money." Without hesitation, Chukwudi walked to the billing office. He quietly paid the remaining medical expenses without revealing his identity. When he returned, Kelechi looked at him with surprise. "You didn't tell her?" "I don't think she needs to know." She smiled warmly. "My father used to say that the best generosity leaves no fingerprints." He laughed softly. "I wish I'd met your father." "I think you would have liked each other." As they prepared to leave, the little boy's mother stopped them. "I don't know who paid." She wiped away tears. "But please thank whoever it was." Chukwudi simply smiled. "We will." Across town, Janet had arranged one final assignment as Mama Ngozi. She accepted temporary work inside an exclusive art exhibition sponsored jointly by the Nwosu Foundation and several private collectors. Both brothers would attend. So would Adaobi and Kelechi. The exhibition featured paintings celebrating African heritage, family, and resilience. Guests wandered slowly through elegant galleries while musicians performed traditional melodies. Mama Ngozi quietly polished display cases near the entrance. Everything unfolded exactly as Janet expected. Until one unexpected incident changed the evening. A young boy no older than 8 became separated from his parents. Frightened, he began crying near the center gallery. Visitors looked around briefly before continuing their conversations. Several assumed security would handle the situation. Adaobi noticed the child. She looked toward an event coordinator. Someone should take care of him. Then she resumed speaking with a foreign ambassador. Moments later, Kelechi heard the crying. She immediately knelt beside the boy. "What's your name?" "Tunde." "Where's your mother?" "I don't know." "It's all right." She gently held his hand. "We'll find her together." Instead of calling loudly across the gallery, she calmly asked security to make a quiet announcement while distracting the frightened child by asking about his favorite school subject. Within minutes, his anxious parents arrived running. His mother embraced him tightly. "Thank you." Kelechi smiled. "I'm just glad he's safe." Janet watched silently. Once again, nobody had instructed Kelechi to help. She simply responded before anyone else. As guests prepared to leave the exhibition, Chinedu found himself watching Kelechi from across the room. He turned toward his brother. "You were right." "About what?" "She's extraordinary." Chukwudi smiled. "I know." At that exact moment, Adaobi approached carrying 2 glasses of sparkling juice. "What are you two discussing?" Chinedu answered honestly. "Kindness." Adaobi laughed lightly. "That's a rare topic at business events." Her joke sounded harmless, yet neither brother laughed with her. For the first time, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Standing alone near the gallery entrance, Janet quietly realized that something important had shifted. She no longer needed elaborate tests. Life itself had begun exposing the truth. The only question remaining was whether Chinedu would accept what his own eyes were finally beginning to see. The engagement ring was ready. When the jeweler called to confirm its completion, Chinedu drove there alone after work. The small velvet box felt surprisingly heavy in his hand as he left the store. For months, he had imagined this moment. He had convinced himself that Adaobi possessed everything he wanted in a life partner. She was intelligent, successful, elegant, respected. On paper, she seemed perfect. Yet, instead of excitement, an unfamiliar uneasiness followed him all the way home. That evening, he placed the ring inside the drawer of his bedside table. He stared at it for several long minutes before quietly closing the drawer again. For the first time since purchasing it, he asked himself a question he had been avoiding. Do I truly know her? Across the city, Janet received another update from her secretary. The ring has been collected. Janet closed her eyes briefly. So it begins. Her secretary hesitated. Should we stop him? Janet slowly shook her head. No. If I stop him now, he'll never understand why. But if he proposes, Janet finished the sentence herself. Then I may lose him. The words hung heavily in the room. She dismissed her secretary and remained alone. Motherhood had taught her many difficult lessons. None had been as painful as allowing someone you loved to approach a mistake they believed was happiness. The following Saturday, Chukwudi invited Kelechi to a small village outside Lagos, where the Nwosu Foundation had recently completed a clean water project. Unlike previous public events, there were no reporters, no donors, no television cameras, only villagers celebrating the opening of their first reliable water system. Children ran joyfully around the new well. Women filled buckets while laughing together. Village elders welcomed the visitors with songs and traditional blessings. Kelechi watched everything with quiet admiration. This is beautiful. Chukwudi smiled. My mother always believed that the greatest investments never appear on stock exchanges. I think I'd like your mother. He looked toward the distant hills. I think she'd like you too. As the celebration continued, one elderly woman approached carrying a basket of fresh mangoes. She offered several pieces of fruit to Chukwudi. He politely accepted one. Then the woman turned toward Kelechi. My daughter. You have kind eyes. Kelechi smiled shyly. Thank you. The old woman gently touched her hand. Never let the world harden your heart. For reasons neither woman understood, Janet's words echoed almost perfectly through the elderly villager. Meanwhile, across Lagos, Adobe hosted a private luncheon for several influential businesswomen. Among the guests were corporate lawyers, bankers, and politicians. The conversation centered around power, influence, expansion, marriage. One guest smiled knowingly. "So? When will we celebrate your engagement?" Adeobi confidently lifted her coffee cup. "I don't think it'll be much longer." Another woman laughed. "You sound certain." "I know, Chinedu." "Does he know?" The women laughed together. Adeobi smiled. "He appreciates ambition." "He certainly does." One guest lowered her voice. "The Nwosu family controls half the country's infrastructure contracts." Another nodded. "Marrying into that family changes everything." Adobe did not disagree. Instead, she smiled quietly. The conversation continued. Not once did anyone mention love. Back in the village, Chukwudi and Kelechi spent the afternoon planting young trees beside the new water station. Several children eagerly joined them. One little boy accidentally spilled an entire bucket of water onto the freshly planted seedlings. His face immediately filled with fear. "I'm sorry. I ruined everything." Before anyone else could respond, Kelechi crouched beside him. "You know what?" "What?" "Trees are very forgiving." She handed him another bucket. "We'll water them again together." Within minutes, the frightened child was smiling. Chukwudi watched silently. She had turned guilt into confidence with only a few gentle words. He realized something profound. Kindness did not merely solve problems, it changed people. That realization stayed with him throughout the drive back to Lagos. Several days later, the Nwosu group organized an appreciation dinner honoring long-serving employees, drivers, gardeners, security guards, receptionists, maintenance workers. Every employee with more than 20 years of service received recognition. Without Janet present, the twins hosted the ceremony together. Mama Ngozi quietly joined the catering staff. She wanted to witness one final gathering before ending her disguise. As employees entered the ballroom, something unexpected happened. Unlike previous luxury events, there were almost no famous guests, only ordinary workers and their families. Many looked nervous wearing their best clothes. For perhaps the first time in years, they occupied the grand ballroom usually reserved for executives. Chukwudi moved from table to table greeting everyone warmly. He remembered birthdays, children's names, medical recoveries, retirement plans. Employees beamed with pride. Chinedu followed behind him. Although slightly more formal, he sincerely thanked each worker for years of loyalty. Janet smiled quietly. Both sons possessed goodness. They simply expressed it differently. Then Adeobi arrived. She looked around the ballroom. Instead of influential investors, she saw janitors, cook's drivers, and cleaners. A flicker of disappointment crossed her face before disappearing. She politely greeted several senior managers, then remained mostly near the executive table. Kelechi arrived a few minutes later after accepting Chukwudi's invitation. Almost immediately, she noticed several elderly employees sitting alone. She quietly joined them. Within minutes, they were laughing together. One retired gardener proudly showed photographs of his grandchildren. Another employee shared stories about Janet and Emeka during the company's earliest days. Kelechi listened with genuine interest. She asked questions, remembered names, thanked them for decades of service. None of them possessed wealth, yet she treated each story as though it mattered. From across the room, Janet watched with tears quietly gathering in her eyes. Late in the evening, the master of ceremonies invited several retired employees to share memories. An 80-year-old former security guard slowly approached the microphone. "My greatest pride wasn't protecting buildings. He smiled toward the twins. It was watching these boys grow into men. The audience applauded warmly. Then he unexpectedly looked toward Mama Ngozi. For one terrifying moment, Janet thought he had recognized her. Instead, he simply smiled kindly. "You remind me of someone." Janet lowered her head respectfully. "So I've been told." The old guard laughed softly and returned to his seat. Janet exhaled in relief. Her secret remained safe, but not for much longer. As the evening ended, Chinedu stood near the ballroom entrance, watching Kelechi patiently helping several elderly employees into waiting vehicles. Nobody had asked her. Nobody was watching. She simply noticed who needed help. He reached into his jacket pocket and touched the small velvet ring box. For the first time since buying it, he did not feel certain about the future. The question that had quietly haunted him for weeks now refused to disappear. Had he fallen in love with the right woman? Standing silently behind the catering table, Janet saw the doubt in her son's eyes. She knew that expression. It was the same one Emeka used to wear whenever his heart discovered something before his mind was ready to accept it. The truth was finally reaching Chinedu, but whether he would embrace it or run from it remained uncertain. The following Monday, Chinedu arrived at the Nwosu Group headquarters earlier than usual. The city was still waking up when he stepped out of his car and entered the nearly empty lobby. For years, he had walked through these glass doors with complete confidence. Today, his mind refused to settle. The ring remained inside his jacket pocket. He had planned to propose before the end of the week. Instead, he kept postponing the moment. Every time he imagined asking Adobe to marry him, another image interrupted his thoughts. Kelechi helping strangers. Kelechi comforting children. Kelechi carrying heavy boxes without complaint. The comparison frustrated him. He respected Kelechi, but Adobe was the woman he loved. Wasn't she? He no longer knew. Upstairs, Chukwudi was already reviewing reports from the foundation. When his brother entered the office, he immediately sensed something was wrong. "You look exhausted." "I didn't sleep much." "Business." Chinedu hesitated. "Life." Chukwudi smiled faintly. "I've been there." His brother sat down across from him. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "What made you trust Kelechi?" The question surprised Chukwudi. He thought carefully before answering. "I never decided to trust her." "What do you mean?" "It happened little by little." "How?" "Every time nobody was watching, she remained exactly the same person." The sentence lingered in the silence between them. Chinedu lowered his eyes. He thanked his brother and quietly returned to his office. Across the city, Janet prepared for the most difficult day of her disguise. She knew the end was approaching. Soon she would have to reveal everything. But before that happened, she wanted to give fate one final opportunity to speak for itself. Through her attorney, she arranged a private luncheon at the Nwosu mansion for both brothers and the two women who had become so important in their lives. The invitation appeared simple, a family discussion about the future of the foundation. Neither Adobe nor Kelechi suspected anything unusual. The luncheon was scheduled for Saturday, 4 days away. Meanwhile, Mama Ngozi accepted one last temporary cleaning assignment. Ironically, it was inside the Nwosu Group headquarters. She had avoided returning there during the entire investigation because too many long-time employees might recognize her. Today, however, the cleaning company assigned her to a newly renovated floor where very few senior staff visited. She quietly pushed her cart through the corridor. Several young employees greeted her politely. None recognized the billionaire behind the faded uniform. Near midday, Janet entered the employee cafeteria carrying a tray. The room buzzed with conversation. Office workers lined up for lunch. She deliberately chose a small table in the corner. As she slowly ate her meal, 2 junior accountants entered. They looked worried. I heard there'll be restructuring. I hope nobody loses their job. Their conversation reminded Janet of her responsibility. Every business decision affected real families. That truth had guided every year of her leadership. As she finished eating, another tray suddenly slipped from someone's hands. Plates shattered across the floor. Soup splashed onto several chairs. The young employee froze. "I'm so sorry." Before the cafeteria staff could respond, Janet quietly stood and reached for a mop. Several employees immediately joined her. Within moments, 5 people were cleaning together. No arguments, no blame, only cooperation. Then Adobe entered the cafeteria. She stopped briefly after seeing the broken dishes. "What happened?" "An accident." She nodded once, then simply walked around the mess and continued toward the executive dining area. Only seconds later, Kalichi entered from another doorway. She had come to deliver educational partnership documents to Chukwudi. Without saying a word, she removed her jacket, rolled up her sleeves, and helped clean the floor. The young employee looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry," Kalechi smiled. "I've dropped worse." Everyone laughed. The nervous tension disappeared immediately. Janet watched quietly. Even after countless observations, the pattern never changed. Later that afternoon, Chinedu unexpectedly witnessed another moment that unsettled him. He had finished an executive meeting and was walking toward the parking garage when he noticed Mama Ngozi struggling with a heavy supply cart. The wheels had become stuck against a small step. She pushed repeatedly. The cart refused to move. Several employees walked past without noticing. Chinedu stopped. "May I help?" Janet looked up through her thick glasses. "Thank you, son." Together they lifted the cart over the step. She smiled warmly. "May God bless you." Something about her voice felt strangely familiar. For a brief moment, Chinedu stared at the elderly woman's face. Had they met before, the feeling disappeared as quickly as it came. "Take care of yourself, Mama." "You too." Janet watched him walk away, her heart filled with conflicting emotions. Despite all his mistakes, her son remained fundamentally kind. His greatest weakness was not cruelty. It was allowing appearances to influence his judgment before his heart had time to speak. That evening, Adobe called Chinedu. "I have wonderful news." "What happened?" "My law firm has been invited to represent an international investment group." "Congratulations!" She laughed excitedly. "This changes everything." "I'm happy for you. We should celebrate." He hesitated. "I have family matters this weekend." "Saturday?" "Yes." She smiled through the phone. "Perfect. I'll see you then." After ending the call, Chinedu opened the drawer beside his bed once again. The engagement ring remained inside its velvet box. He picked it up, turned it slowly beneath the bedroom light, then placed it back inside the drawer without opening the box, for the 3rd consecutive night. Across town, Chukwudi sat on the balcony of his home speaking with Kelechi over the phone. "What are you doing tomorrow?" she asked. "Visiting one of our scholarship students." "Can I come?" "I was hoping you'd ask." She laughed. "I've become predictable." In the best way. Neither realized how naturally their conversations had become. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic promises, only quiet comfort. Exactly the kind of foundation Janet had always hoped love would have. Late that night, Janet returned to the mansion for the first time in months, not through the front entrance. She quietly entered through a private side gate using a key only she possessed. The house stood silent. She walked alone through the dark hallway. Family photographs still decorated the walls. She stopped before the portrait of Emika. "I've done everything I could," she whispered softly. "I only hope they'll understand why." After several moments, she turned toward the grand dining room. In just a few days, everyone would gather around this table. Her disguise would end. Secrets would become truth, and the future of the Nwosu family would change forever. Saturday arrived with bright sunshine over Lagos. The Nwosu mansion stood exactly as it always had, elegant and peaceful behind its tall iron gates. Gardeners trimmed hedges, fountains shimmered beneath the morning light, and household staff prepared the formal dining room for the private luncheon Janet had quietly arranged through her attorney. Officially, the gathering had only one purpose. The twins were told that several important decisions concerning the Nwosu Foundation required discussion before Janet returned from Europe. Neither brother questioned the invitation. Shortly before noon, Chukwudi arrived first. He greeted the familiar staff warmly before entering the drawing room. A few minutes later, Kelechi stepped inside, wearing a simple cream dress that reflected her quiet personality. She looked slightly nervous because she had never attended such an intimate family gathering. "I hope I'm not underdressed," she whispered. Chukwudi smiled reassuringly. "You look exactly like yourself." "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is." Moments later, another luxury vehicle stopped outside. Adaobi stepped out confidently, wearing an elegant designer suit. She carried herself with the same polished grace that had impressed business leaders across Lagos. After exchanging polite greetings, everyone waited for Janet's attorney to arrive. The only person missing was Janet herself. Chinedu glanced at his watch. "Mother hates being late." The family butler bowed respectfully. "Madam sent word that she may be delayed for a short while, sir." Chinedu nodded. "We'll wait." While refreshments were served, conversation remained light. The attorney discussed foundation projects. Chukwudi shared updates from rural education programs. Kelechi described new literacy initiatives in public schools. Adaobi spoke confidently about legal reforms affecting non-profit organizations. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Hidden behind the service corridor, however, Janet stood silently wearing the familiar appearance of Mama Ngozi. Her faded dress, gray wig, old sandals, walking cane. She looked at herself one final time in a small mirror. Weeks earlier, she had entered this disguise hoping to discover the truth. Today, she would leave it forever. Her heartbeat quickened. Not because she feared being recognized, because she feared hurting her sons. The butler approached quietly. "They're ready." Janet nodded. "Let's begin." A few seconds later, Mama Ngozi slowly entered the dining room, carrying a silver tray filled with tea. Neither brother looked at her twice. They assumed she was another temporary worker. She carefully poured tea into each cup. When she reached Adaobi, she deliberately allowed the teapot to tilt slightly. A few drops landed on the edge of the saucer. Adaobi immediately frowned. "Please be careful." "I'm sorry, ma'am." "You've been working here long." "No." "It shows." The room fell briefly silent. Chukwudi looked uncomfortable. Kelechi quietly reached for a napkin. "It's only a few drops." She gently wiped the saucer herself before smiling toward Mama Ngozi. "There. No harm done." Janet thanked her softly. Before she could step away, the attorney suddenly addressed everyone. "Before we discuss foundation matters, I'd like to introduce someone." The room turned toward him. He continued calmly. "For several weeks, one person has been conducting an independent evaluation requested personally by Mrs. Janet Nwosu." Chinedu looked surprised. "What evaluation?" "The character of those closest to this family." Confusion spread across every face. Adaobi exchanged a puzzled glance with Chinedu. "What are you talking about?" Instead of answering, the attorney looked toward Mama Ngozi. "You may begin." The elderly woman slowly placed the silver tray on the table. No one spoke. With trembling fingers, she reached toward her gray wig. Chukwudi frowned. "What is happening?" The wig came off first, then the thick glasses. Finally, Janet removed the light facial makeup that had concealed her appearance. Silence filled the room. Complete silence. The twins stared without blinking. Chinedu instinctively stepped backward. His face turned completely pale. "Mother." Kelechi covered her mouth in shock. Adobe's eyes widened with disbelief. Janet slowly lifted her head. "Yes, it's me." For several long seconds, nobody moved. The only sound came from the fountain outside the open windows. Finally, Chukwudi found his voice. "You were Mama Ngozi." Janet nodded quietly. "I was." Chinedu looked completely overwhelmed. "Impossible. You've been—" He struggled to finish the sentence. "Watching us." "Yes." His expression changed from shock to pain. "You lied to us." Janet accepted the accusation without argument. "I did." "Why?" "Because I needed the truth." The attorney quietly placed Janet's notebook onto the dining table. "This contains every observation." Chinedu stared at the notebook. "You investigated us?" "No." Janet answered gently. "I investigated the people who might become my daughters." Adobe finally spoke. "This is unbelievable." Janet looked directly at her. "I agree. It should never have been necessary." Adobe folded her arms. "You judged me while pretending to be a servant. I observed you. Those are different things." "They are." Janet's voice remained calm. "That is why I never judged you after one meeting." She gently opened this notebook. "There are 73 separate observations." No one interrupted. Janet turned several pages. "I watched how you treated waiters." Another page. "Drivers?" Another. "Cleaners?" Another. "Elderly strangers?" She finally closed the notebook. "And people who could offer you nothing." Adeobi remained silent. Janet then turned toward Kelechi. "I watched you too." Kelechi lowered her eyes. "I didn't know." "I know. You were never performing." A tear rolled down Janet's cheek. "You simply lived according to your heart." The room remained painfully quiet. Chinedu looked from his mother to Adobe and back again. His breathing became heavier. "You planned all of this," Janet nodded slowly. "I prayed I would be wrong." He looked toward Adobe. "Tell me, is she wrong?" Adobe hesitated for the first time since entering the mansion. She searched for words. "I've always expected excellence." Janet answered softly. "Excellence without compassion becomes pride." Adobe looked away. Nobody defended her, not even herself. Chinedu reached into his jacket pocket. Slowly, he removed the small velvet ring box. Everyone watched silently. He looked at it for several seconds before placing it gently onto the dining table. "I was going to propose." His voice trembled. "I almost built my future without truly seeing the person beside me." Janet stepped toward her son. She wanted to embrace him. Instead, she waited. This decision belonged to him alone. For the first time in his life, Chinedu realized that success, beauty, intelligence, and ambition could never replace kindness. And that realization hurt more deeply than any business failure he had ever experienced. The truth had finally been revealed, but the consequences were only beginning. No one spoke for nearly a full minute. The silence inside the dining room felt heavier than any argument. The unopened velvet ring box remained in the center of the table, becoming the only object anyone seemed able to see. Chinedu stared at it without moving. His hands trembled slightly. Everything he believed about the past few months had collapsed within minutes. Janet did not interrupt his thoughts. She understood that some lessons could not be explained. They had to be lived. Finally, Chinedu lifted his eyes toward Adaobi. I need you to answer one question. Her voice remained steady, though the confidence she usually carried had begun to fade. What question? Were you ever in love with me? Adaobi hesitated. I cared about you. That's not what I asked. She looked around the room before answering. I admired you. He nodded slowly. I know. You inspired me. I know. His voice became quieter. But did you love me? For the first time since anyone had met her, Adaobi struggled to find the right words. Several long seconds passed. I believed we would build an extraordinary life together. Chinedu closed his eyes briefly. You still didn't answer. She finally lowered her head. I don't know. The admission echoed through the room. It was not cruel. It was simply honest. Janet felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. At least the truth was no longer hiding behind beautiful speeches. Adaobi took a deep breath before speaking again. I grew up believing that success solved everything. She looked toward Janet. My parents taught me that respect follows wealth. She smiled bitterly. I spent so many years chasing powerful people that I forgot how to see ordinary ones. Nobody interrupted her. I never planned to become a bad person. Her voice cracked for the first time. I simply stopped noticing who I was becoming. Janet listened carefully. There was no anger inside her anymore, only compassion. We all become blind in different ways, Janet said softly. The important question is whether we choose to open our eyes. A tear rolled down Adaobi's cheek. I don't expect forgiveness. Janet shook her head. This isn't about punishment. It's about truth. Adaobi looked toward Chinedu one final time. I think your mother saved both of us. He looked surprised. If we had married now, she forced a faint smile. We would have spent years pretending to be happy. She reached toward the engagement ring. Without opening the box, she gently pushed it back across the table. It belongs to your future. But not with me. She stood slowly. Before leaving, she turned toward Kelechi. I owe you an apology. Kelechi looked startled. For what? For judging people whose hearts were far richer than mine. She glanced toward Janet. And for failing every test without even knowing I was being tested. Janet walked forward. Instead of criticizing Adaobi, she embraced her. The room fell silent once again. Adaobi began crying openly. I don't deserve this. Janet held her gently. No. You deserve the opportunity to become better. After several moments, Adaobi stepped back. I think I need to discover who I am without chasing someone else's name. She nodded respectfully to everyone before quietly leaving the mansion. The sound of the closing front door echoed through the hallway. No one followed her. Some journeys had to begin alone. Inside the dining room, only Janet, her sons Kelechi, and the attorney remained. Chinedu sank slowly into his chair. I almost married someone I didn't truly know. Janet sat beside him. No. You almost married someone who didn't truly know herself. He looked at his mother. Is there a difference? There is. People can change. He remained silent. I hope she does. So do I. Across the table, Chukwudi reached for Kelechi's hand almost without thinking. She looked at him with surprise. He smiled nervously. I don't want today to become only about pain. She squeezed his hand gently. It doesn't have to. Janet noticed the quiet gesture and smiled. It reminded her so much of Emeka. Love had never been loud between them. It had always appeared in small moments. Helping, listening, waiting, choosing each other again and again. The attorney quietly gathered his documents. My work here is finished. Janet thanked him sincerely. You helped protect this family. He smiled. I only helped reveal what was already there. After he departed, the family moved into the garden behind the mansion. The afternoon sun reflected beautifully across the fountain. Birds sang among the flowering trees Emika had planted many years earlier. For the first time in months, Janet walked through the garden without the disguise. Every member of the household who recognized her smiled with relief. Welcome home, madam. She thanked each one personally. Many had unknowingly crossed paths with Mama Ngozi during the previous weeks. None had recognized her. Standing beneath an old mango tree, Chinedu finally spoke again. Mother. She turned. I'm sorry. She gently shook her head. You have nothing to apologize for. I doubted the values you taught us. You didn't. You simply forgot them for a while. He nodded slowly. I want to earn back your trust. Janet smiled warmly. You never lost it. My trust was never in your decisions. It was in your heart. I knew it would eventually lead you home. Tears filled Chinedu's eyes. For the first time since childhood, he embraced his mother without saying another word. Nearby, Kelechi quietly wiped away her own tears. She had witnessed wealth before. She had never witnessed humility like this. Later that evening, after dinner, Chukwudi asked Janet if they could speak privately. They walked together along the garden path. I love her, Janet smiled knowingly. I noticed. I've never been more certain about anything. She stopped walking. Then don't rush. He looked surprised. You still want me to wait? I want you to build a marriage. Not simply plan a wedding. He laughed softly. That sounds exactly like father. She looked toward the stars beginning to appear above Lagos. He used to tell me that weddings last one day. But character carries a marriage for a lifetime. Chukwudi nodded. I'll remember. Inside the mansion, Chinedu opened the velvet ring box one final time. He looked at the diamond for several quiet moments. Then he closed the box, walked into his father's old study, and placed it inside the desk drawer. Not as a symbol of failure, but as a reminder that love without character could never become the foundation of a family. Outside, Janet stood alone beneath the evening sky. Her secret mission had ended. Yet she knew one final chapter still remained. Not the story of deception, but the story of healing forgiveness and a future rebuilt on truth. 3 months passed. The events inside the dining room at the Nwosu mansion gradually became a private family memory rather than a painful wound. Life did not return to the way it had been before. Instead, it slowly became something healthier, something more honest. Janet resumed leading the Nwosu group, though she no longer spent every day inside the corporate headquarters. She delegated more responsibility to her sons and devoted increasing time to the foundation she and Emika had built together. Her greatest investment was no longer measured in profits. It was measured in people. Chinedu changed more than anyone expected. The transformation did not happen overnight. There were no dramatic speeches, no public declarations. Instead, the changes appeared quietly. He began visiting company departments without advance notice, not to inspect performance, but to speak with employees. He ate lunch in the staff cafeteria instead of the executive dining room. He learned the names of cleaners, drivers, gardeners, and security guards who had worked for the family for decades. One afternoon, he found the elderly maintenance worker who had once struggled with a heavy cleaning cart. I'm sorry, Chinedu said. The old man looked confused. For what, sir? For all the times I walked past without truly seeing you. The man smiled gently. You see me now. Yes. Then there's nothing left to apologize for. That simple answer stayed with Chinedu for days. Meanwhile, Adaobi quietly disappeared from Lagos society. Many newspapers speculated about the end of her relationship with Chinedu, but neither of them gave interviews. Instead of chasing another wealthy family, Adaobi resigned from her prestigious law firm and accepted a position with a non-profit legal organization that provided free legal assistance to widows, abandoned mothers, and low-income workers. The salary was only a fraction of what she once earned. Many colleagues questioned her decision. She simply smiled. For the first time in my life, I'm learning the difference between building a career and building a character. Months later, Janet quietly visited one of the nonprofit's legal clinics without revealing her identity. She watched from a distance as Adaobi patiently listened to an elderly widow who could not afford legal representation. There were no photographers, no influential politicians, no wealthy clients. Only two women sitting across a small wooden desk. When the meeting ended, Janet left without saying a word. She smiled all the way home. People really could change. Across the city, Chukwudi and Kelechi continued growing closer. Their relationship never attracted newspaper headlines because neither of them wanted publicity. On weekends, they still visited schools, orphanages, hospitals, and rural communities together. Sometimes they spent entire afternoons reading stories to children. Other days they planted trees or repaired classrooms. Neither considered these activities extraordinary. They simply became part of their shared life. One evening, while walking through the same village where they had opened the clean water project months earlier, Chukwudi stopped beneath the large mango tree overlooking the new well. Children's laughter echoed through the village. Women filled buckets with clean water. The trees they had planted together were beginning to grow. He turned toward Kelechi. "I finally understand something." "What is it?" "My father built an empire." She nodded. "My mother protected it." Another nod. "But you taught me why it exists." She looked at him curiously. "So families like these could have hope." He smiled. "You've been teaching me from the day we met." Then, without any audience, photographers, or elaborate decorations, Chukwudi reached into his pocket. He removed a small velvet ring box. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only peace. "Kelechi Eze." She looked at him with tears already forming in her eyes. "I don't promise a perfect life. I don't promise endless wealth. I don't even promise easy days." He opened the ring box. "But I promise that every decision I make will begin with the values my parents gave me and the kindness you reminded me never to lose." He took a slow breath. "Will you marry me?" Kelechi smiled through tears. "I thought you'd never ask." She laughed softly before answering, "Yes." The nearby children, having noticed nothing more than two adults smiling at one another, began clapping happily without understanding what had happened. Their innocent applause filled the quiet village with unexpected joy. Several weeks later, the Nwosu mansion welcomed guests once again. This time, there were no hidden identities, no secret investigations, no painful revelations, only celebration. Employees who had served the family for decades stood beside executives. Village teachers stood beside business leaders. Drivers, gardeners, cooks, and cleaners sat at the same reception tables as politicians and wealthy investors. That seating arrangement had been Janet's personal request. "No one who helped build this family will ever sit behind it again," she said. The ceremony itself remained beautifully simple. As Chukwudi and Kelechi exchanged their vows, Janet looked toward the empty chair reserved in memory of Emeka. A single white rose rested upon it. She whispered softly, "We did it." Although no one answered, she somehow felt he already knew. After the ceremony, Chinedu approached his brother. He embraced him tightly. "You chose well." Chukwudi smiled. "I almost didn't." Chinedu shook his head. "No. You were always walking in the right direction. I just needed Mother to remind me how to find mine." Janet overheard the conversation. She walked toward both sons and held their hands together. "When your father and I built this company," she said, "we hoped to leave you success." She smiled warmly. "But today I realize the greatest inheritance was never money. It was the ability to recognize goodness before wealth." The brothers nodded together. As evening settled over the mansion, music filled the gardens. Children danced beside the fountain. Employees laughed with executives. Families who once believed they belonged to different worlds shared the same tables, the same stories, and the same celebration. Standing quietly beneath the stars, Janet looked around with deep gratitude. Her disguise had lasted only a few weeks. The lesson it revealed would guide her family for generations. She finally understood that the greatest legacy a parent could leave behind was not an empire of buildings, contracts, or fortunes. It was raising children who would always choose character over appearances, compassion over pride, and truth over comfort.